The evening sky over Naples bled in shades of bruised gold and storm gray. The wind whispered down narrow alleys, carrying the salt of the sea and the sound of distant thunder. The city was alive as it always was, reckless laughter from street corners, the hum of engines, the clinking of glasses in old bars. But somewhere between the heartbeats of the city moved a shadow in a black suit, Lorenzo D'Amato. Men spoke his name with caution. In the underworld, he was not just a man. He was a storm disguised as silence, a ruler whose power came not from shouting but from the unshakable calm that lingered before destruction. He had built an empire of fear, controlling ports, shipments, and the veins of money that ran through Naples like hidden rivers. Yet on that night, as rain began to fall softly over the streets, the feared man did not walk into one of his lavish clubs or estates. He stepped into a small diner at the edge of the city. It was nothing special. Cracked neon lights flickered above its sign, and the smell of fried onions and coffee clung to the air. Inside, laughter mingled with the low hum of an old jukebox. People barely noticed him at first. Just another tall man in a dark coat, leading a small girl by the hand. But if they looked closer, they might have seen it. How every step he took seemed to silence the world around him, how his presence drew the air taut, like a string pulled to its limit. The little girl beside him, Sophia, couldn't have been more than 8. Her black hair framed a pale face, her eyes dull and distant. There was no joy in her step, no spark in her gaze. She moved like a ghost in the world of the living, her small hand limp in her father's. Her mother had been gone for months now, taken by illness, buried beneath marble and flowers Lorenzo had bought with money that couldn't buy peace. The mansion had grown colder since then, silent halls filled only with echoes of a child's quiet sobs and a father's restless pacing. He had tried everything, doctors, priests, therapists, but grief was not something that could be bribed, cured, or threatened. That night, he was simply tired. He only wanted his daughter to eat. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Warmth greeted them, a sudden contrast to the rain outside. The scent of pancakes and coffee mingled with something homely, something soft. A few customers turned to look, their eyes flicking quickly away when they recognized him, and then, from behind the counter, she appeared, a woman with gentle eyes and dark brown hair tied in a messy bun, her apron slightly stained from the evening rush. There was nothing extraordinary about her at first glance. She was ordinary in the most beautiful way, real, warm, and alive. Her name was Isabella Moretti, though Lorenzo did not know it yet. When she saw the little girl, her expression softened. She didn't look at Lorenzo the way others did, with fear or admiration, but instead looked at Sophia with quiet concern. The child hesitated when the woman knelt to her level, offering a soft smile. And then, for the first time in weeks, Lorenzo saw it, a flicker of curiosity in Sophia's eyes, like a candle struggling to burn through darkness. Something shifted in that diner. Lorenzo sat quietly in the corner booth, his hands folded on the table as he watched. Isabella moved with a rhythm that didn't belong to the chaos of the city. There was grace in her simplicity, warmth in the way she placed a plate on the table, care in how she spoke to the people around her. Sophia ate slowly, and Lorenzo felt something tighten in his chest when he saw the corners of her lips curve upward. Just a small smile. Fragile, fleeting, but real. Outside, thunder rolled again. But inside that small diner, there was a rare calm. For weeks after, he returned. Every morning, every evening. Sometimes alone, sometimes with Sophia. The waitress would greet them with the same gentle smile, her presence softening the edges of a man the world called ruthless. Sophia began to talk more. She laughed. She asked for pancakes, sometimes even told small stories about her dreams. Each time, Lorenzo felt something unfamiliar, a quiet ache that wasn't pain but longing. He began to notice things he hadn't before. How Isabella tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. How she wiped the same counter 3 times when she was deep in thought. How she sang softly under her breath when she thought no one was listening. He told himself it was nothing. Just gratitude. Just respect. But something inside him was shifting, something dangerous and human. The man who once ruled with cold logic found himself slowing down, staying longer after meals, pretending to read the paper just to hear her footsteps moving behind him, and Sophia noticed too. She grew happier, brighter. Sometimes she drew pictures on napkins, 3 figures holding hands beneath the sun. Lorenzo always looked away, pretending not to see, but the image burned into his memory each time, a tea night, in his office. Surrounded by files of blood and betrayal, he'd find himself staring at those napkins, at the childish sketches of smiles and hearts. He'd fold them gently, as though they were more fragile than all the power he had ever held. One evening, as rain battered the city once again, Lorenzo found himself standing outside the diner long after closing time. The lights were dim, the chairs stacked. Through the fogged window, he saw Isabella wiping the last table, humming softly. She moved with a kind of peace he had never known, and for the first time in a long time, the Mafia boss of Naples realized he envied a simple waitress. Not her freedom, not her life, but her ability to exist without the weight of guilt, without the shadow of sin. That night, as he walked back to his car, something inside him cracked quietly. It wasn't love yet. It wasn't even clarity. It was the beginning of redemption, small, quiet, and unnoticed by the world. And it had started with a smile. The winter deepened. The winds from the Tyrrhenian Sea grew sharp, dragging sheets of rain against the city's cobblestones. The nights stretched long and cold, heavy with the kind of silence that only grief understands. Inside the D'Amato mansion, an expanse of marble and shadows perched above the bay. The warmth that had once filled its rooms was gone. Portraits stared down from the walls like ghosts of a life that had ended too soon. The air smelled of cigar smoke and old whiskey. Lorenzo sat alone in his study most evenings. The desk before him was clean, too clean for a man who had built an empire. The papers that used to define his days, ledgers of blood, contracts sealed with silence, lay untouched. What occupied his thoughts now wasn't the business that fed his power, but the fragile sound of a child's laughter that had begun to return to the house. It was Sophia's laughter. Thin, uncertain, but real. He had heard it in the diner weeks ago. He had heard it again at home when she spoke of the woman with the kind eyes and warm hands. The waitress. Isabella. The name itself felt strange on his tongue, soft where his world was hard. He found himself thinking of her even in the middle of meetings, her presence creeping into his mind like sunlight through a closed window. He told himself it was nothing. Gratitude, perhaps. A father's appreciation for someone who could reach his child in a way he could not. But then, one night, Sophia's laughter stopped. It began with a cough, light at first, the sort every child gets. But by dawn, her small body burned with fever. The doctors came. Machines were brought into her room, their beeping filling the silence with fear. Lorenzo stood by her bedside, helpless. The empire he had built, his money, his influence, his control, was worthless here. She tossed and turned, her lips whispering something in delirium. When he leaned close, he heard the name she murmured. Not his, Isabella. A slow panic took root inside him. Not the kind that came with danger or betrayal, but the kind that claws at the soul of a father watching his child slip away. Hours passed. The fever climbed higher. And then, at the edge of his despair, he did something he had never done in all his life. He picked up the phone and called for help. Not from his men, not from his allies, but from her. When she arrived, rain still clung to her hair, her breath short from running. She looked at him only once before going to Sophia's side. Her hands, trembling at first, grew steady as they touched the child's forehead, wiping away sweat, whispering words too soft for him to hear. Lorenzo stood in the doorway and watched. The clock ticked, slow and relentless. The storm outside battered the windows, thunder rolling like the growl of the world itself. But inside that room, something changed. The child's breathing steadied. The fever broke before dawn. When Sophia finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was not her father, but the woman who had come through the rain to hold her hand. Lorenzo's heart clenched in a way he didn't understand. When Isabella turned toward him, exhaustion in her eyes, he saw no fear. Only concern. only the quiet relief of someone who had fought through the night for someone else's child. In that moment, gratitude wasn't enough. Something else had begun, something fragile, dangerous, unspoken. Days turned into weeks again. Isabella returned often, first to check on Sophia, then to share meals, to bring stories, to fill the house with a presence that softened even the stone-hearted guards who patrolled the estate. The staff began to whisper about her. The woman who smiled at the boss and lived to tell it. The woman who walked through the halls of power as though she belonged there. Sophia began to thrive. She laughed again, painted pictures, ran through the gardens that had been empty for so long. Every corner of the mansion that Isabella touched seemed to warm, and with every day, Lorenzo's world tilted further from what it had been. He started to cancel meetings. He sat with them during breakfast, listening to their quiet conversations. He found himself watching Isabella when she didn't know, noticing how she hummed as she worked, how the morning light caught in her hair, how she moved with a grace that had nothing to do with elegance and everything to do with peace. But even in this new quiet, he could not shake the weight of who he was. Men like him did not deserve soft things. They did not build families, they broke them. And yet, one evening, as the sun slipped beneath the horizon, his daughter ran into the room and looked up at him with eyes that held no fear, only hope. She wanted Isabella to stay. Always, the words were simple, but they cut deep. He saw his late wife's ghost in his daughter's smile, and behind it, he saw the truth. Sophia's happiness had returned, but it was built on a foundation he did not understand. He thought of the empire waiting outside those walls. The enemies who would never forgive weakness. The blood that had built his fortune. And still, as he looked at his daughter's face, he found himself imagining a life that had no guns, no debts, no shadows. That night, he stood alone in the garden, the sea wind pulling at his coat. The city lights flickered below, distant and cold. He could hear laughter from the house, soft, domestic, belonging to another kind of man. The idea came slowly, a thought too wild to name. But by the time the moon rose over the water, it had rooted itself in his mind. If his daughter wanted that woman to stay, then she would stay. He did not yet know that the decision would unmake him. He only knew that for the first time in years, he was ready to give something, not to power, not to revenge, but to the fragile warmth of a child's happiness. And so began the deal he never planned to make. The sky above Naples had turned to pale silver the morning it happened, as if the world itself had gone quiet to watch what could not be undone. The mansion, normally guarded by the tension of hidden men and the echo of orders, was still. Even the sea beyond the cliffs lay calm, a sheet of light trembling in the distance. Lorenzo D'Amato stood by the window of his study, the faint smell of rain lingering on his clothes. He had not slept. The night had been long, a slow war between reason and a father's heart. His empire whispered for his attention, but he no longer answered its call. The men who once looked to him for power now waited for his word with unease, wondering why their king had gone silent. He told no one what he planned to do. In the early hours, he had walked through the halls where his daughter's laughter echoed faintly, where Isabella's soft footsteps followed the rhythm of home. He had stopped outside Sophia's room. She was asleep, one arm wrapped around the handmade doll Isabella had given her. Her breathing was calm, her face peaceful. It was a sight that hurt him. Beauty born from a life he could not give her alone. He had spent years carving fear into others, but it was this quiet love that carved through him. The decision came not as impulse but as surrender. A man who had conquered everything was finally conquered by the simple desire to keep joy alive in his daughter's eyes. That afternoon, the courtyard was prepared. No luxury, no gold, no witnesses of power, just simplicity. A priest was called, one who had blessed more funerals than weddings in this house. He stood nervously beneath the archway of climbing vines, his voice trembling as he prayed. Sophia wore a small white dress. Her hands clapped with excitement she could not contain. Around her, the household staff moved in silence, unsure if they were watching the beginning of hope or the end of an era. Lorenzo appeared from the hall in a black suit, the same kind he wore for business, but without the sharpness of armor. His eyes were heavy, his face unreadable, the weight of what he was about to do pressing into his shoulders. And then Isabella stepped into the light. She wore no gown, only a simple ivory dress that brushed her knees, her hair loose, her eyes uncertain. There was no trace of the glamour that followed the women of Lorenzo's world. She looked like herself, honest, unguarded, fragile in a way that demanded strength to face him. Their gazes met, and for a moment the sounds of the city faded. He had no words prepared. He had always commanded, never asked. He had lived by control, by taking. Yet here, in this quiet courtyard, the act before him was not one of power but of offering. The priest spoke softly, his voice swallowed by the wind. Lorenzo's answers came low, steady, more like confessions than vows. Isabella's voice was barely audible, but when she spoke, the tremor carried truth, and rings of diamonds, no applause. Only the sound of waves breaking against the cliffs below, and Sophia's small hands clutching a handful of wildflowers she had picked herself. When it was done, the priest stepped back. There was a long, still pause. Lorenzo looked at the woman now standing before him, not as an arrangement, not as a duty, but as something unknown. She looked back with a mixture of fear and understanding, as if she knew she was walking into a storm but refused to step away. Sophia ran to them, her laughter breaking the silence, and wrapped her arms around them both. The small warmth of her body against their hands felt like a promise neither had the courage to speak aloud. That night, the mansion held a kind of peace it had not known in years. Lorenzo sat by the fire, the glow reflecting in his glass of wine. Across from him, Isabella tended to Sophia, tucking her into bed, brushing her hair with slow, patient movements. The sight was too ordinary, too human, for a man whose life had been nothing but survival. When Isabella turned, their eyes met again. For the briefest moment, the room around them seemed to dissolve. The guards, the walls, the weight of the world. There was only the faint hum of the sea and the flicker of the fire. He felt something unfamiliar.
It was not love yet.
Not forgiveness.
Just stillness.
The kind that follows years of chaos. As the night deepened, he stepped outside into the garden. The air was cold, and the city lights below glittered like fallen stars. He thought of all he had built, the empire of fear, the money, the power, and felt the emptiness of it against what he had just gained. He had married her for his daughter's smile. Yet even as he told himself that, a quiet voice within him whispered another truth, that perhaps he had also done it for his own. The days that followed their quiet wedding passed like slow-moving clouds across a gray sky, steady, heavy, but edged with light. The mansion, once filled with the echo of business and threat, began to change. Small things first. The smell of fresh bread in the mornings instead of cigars. The laughter of a child running through hallways that had forgotten such sounds. And in the midst of it all, Lorenzo D'Amato found himself a stranger in his own home. He woke each morning to the soft sounds of life that did not belong to his old world. Porcelain clinking against marble, the low hum of a woman singing softly as she brewed coffee, the murmur of Sophia's voice drifting through open doors. They were sounds he could neither command nor control. They belonged to a realm of peace he had never known, but beyond those walls, his empire still breathed. The streets still whispered his name, his men still carried his orders, and his enemies still feared him. It was a world that demanded his cruelty, even as the world inside his home demanded his humanity. The two could not coexist. Each evening, when the sun dipped behind the horizon and shadows stretched across the courtyard, Lorenzo became what he had always been, the man who ruled by fear. He met with his captains, signed shipments, handled debts, and ordered silence where there was noise. His face hardened, his voice grew cold, and the warmth of the day vanished like mist. But when he returned home, that hardness no longer fit. He would pause outside the door, his hand on the handle, feeling the weight of blood on his conscience and the faint sound of laughter beyond it. He had built walls around himself his entire life, but now those walls felt like a cage. Inside, Isabella would be waiting, never questioning, never pressing. She spoke to him only when needed, her presence neither submissive nor afraid. She treated him as if he were simply a man, not the shadow the world feared. Sometimes he watched her from a distance. The way she brushed Sophia's hair before bed. The way she touched the piano keys in the empty parlor late at night, playing melodies too soft to carry beyond the room. He didn't understand how someone could live with so much grace in a house haunted by his past, but even she could not reach all the way into his darkness. The first crack came one evening when he returned from a meeting gone wrong. His car pulled into the courtyard long after midnight. The men who followed him bore the marks of battle, cuts, bruises, the smell of smoke. Blood stained the cuff of his sleeve. He walked through the house like a ghost, past servants who pretended not to see. In the hallway, Isabella appeared. No fear in her eyes, only quiet resolve. She moved to him, took his coat, and saw the stain on his shirt. Her gaze held his for a moment longer than it should have. Without a word, she fetched a bowl of warm water, a towel, and began to clean the wound on his shoulder. The air between them was still. Only the sound of water dripping, the faint hiss of the fire, and the distant waves breaking below the cliffs. Her touch was gentle but firm, the kind that made him feel both exposed and human. He watched her as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips pressed tight. He felt the sting of the wound, but beneath it, something deeper burned. A question he could not silence. Why was she not afraid? When she finished, she stepped back, eyes lifting to meet his. There was no judgment in her gaze, only quiet sadness. She did not speak, but her silence said what words could not, that the violence he carried would one day destroy everything he now had. That night, when she left him alone in the study, he sat by the fire and stared at his hands. They were hands that had built an empire, taken lives, signed orders that shaped the city's underworld. But now, under the dim light, they trembled. For the first time in years, Lorenzo D'Amato wondered what his daughter would see if she looked at him as the world did, not as her father, but as the monster behind the mask. Days turned into weeks. The duality of his life tore at him. He found excuses to stay home longer, to walk Sophia to the garden, to help her feed the doves that gathered near the fountain. Each time he saw her laugh beneath the sun, he felt both joy and guilt. He began to avoid the meetings that required his cruelty. The men noticed. Whispers spread. Some said the boss had softened. Others said love had made him weak. And maybe it had, because one night, when an old ally came to him seeking vengeance for a betrayal, Lorenzo refused. He sent the man away, his voice calm but final. It was the first time he had ever chosen mercy. That choice cost him. The next morning, a message arrived. 2 of his men were found dead by the docks, a warning written in blood across the warehouse wall. Mercy is death, the old Lorenzo would have responded with fire. But this one did not. He simply walked through his garden that evening, Sophia chasing butterflies at his feet, Isabella reading by the steps. The sun dipped low, painting their faces in gold. For a fleeting moment, he felt what peace might look like. He knew it would not last. But as he watched his daughter's laughter dance across the air, he understood something he had never dared to before. There are wars worth ending, even if they end the man who fought them. That night, when he lay beside Isabella for the first time, sleep did not come. The storm outside rose, the windows rattled, and yet the sound of her breathing beside him was enough to steady his heart. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in decades, the gun on the bedside table felt unnecessary. The night that followed was not quiet. The storm outside carried the voice of something greater, as if the heavens themselves were washing away the sins buried in the walls of the D'Amato estate. Rain struck against the windows, and thunder rolled over the cliffs like an angry god. But inside that vast house, a fragile peace lingered. Lorenzo D'Amato lay awake, eyes open in the dark, listening to the rhythm of Isabella's breathing beside him. He had lived through ambushes, betrayals, and years of blood-soaked nights, yet nothing had ever made him feel so vulnerable as that sound. It was the sound of someone sleeping without fear. Beside him, he turned his head slightly, his eyes tracing the faint outline of her silhouette in the lightning's brief flashes. Her hair spilled across the pillow like spilled ink, her hand resting near his. And in that small, human space between them, he felt something shift, a warmth unfamiliar, dangerous in its tenderness. For the first time, the Mafia boss of Palermo, the man whose name made even silence tremble, felt small, but in a way that made him whole. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world cleansed and silent. The sea stretched endlessly below the cliffs, the sun bleeding pale gold across its surface. Sophia's laughter echoed faintly from the garden, and Isabella's voice floated through the hall as she helped the child feed the doves. Lorenzo watched them from the balcony, a cup of black coffee untouched in his hands. He didn't belong in this world. Not yet. He stood there, half shadow, half man, torn between two lives, the empire that had raised him and the peace that now called his name. But he knew peace came at a price. That afternoon, his old consigliere, Marco Vitali, arrived unannounced. Marco had been with him since the beginning, loyal, deadly, and silent. His face was lined with age, but his eyes still burned like cold fire. When he stepped into the study, the air itself seemed to darken. "Your silence is making the wolves restless," Marco said. "You can't ignore them forever." Lorenzo said nothing. He merely stared at the rain-streaked window, the city below hidden by mist. "They think you've gone soft. They think the waitress and the child have stolen your spine." Marco's voice softened then, but only slightly. "You taught them fear, Lorenzo. You can't let them unlearn it." Lorenzo's hand tightened around the glass he was holding. He could feel the weight of the world he had built pressing against his chest, but then he thought of Sophia, her tiny arms around his neck, the way she called him Papa with unguarded joy, and Isabella, quiet, strong, forgiving, living proof that peace wasn't weakness. He turned, his eyes calm but cold. "I didn't build this empire to keep it alive by killing everything I love." Marco's jaw clenched. "You built it with blood. You can't wash that away with lullabies." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. When Marco left, the decision was already made, though Lorenzo didn't yet know what it would cost him. That night, the past came knocking. A convoy of black cars rolled up the gravel path. Their headlights cut through the darkness like blades. Lorenzo watched from the window as men stepped out. Old allies turned enemies. Faces he once trusted now hungry for the power they thought he'd surrendered. He knew what they came for. They wanted his throne, or his corpse. Isabella found him in the study, standing in front of the fire, calm as the eye of a storm. Her voice trembled, but her resolve didn't. "Lorenzo, please don't go down there." He turned slowly, and for the first time, there was softness in his eyes, the kind that made even fear falter. "This is the last time," he said quietly, though his lips barely moved. "After tonight it ends." She didn't speak again. Instead, she crossed the room, took his hand, and pressed it against her chest, against the steady beat of her heart. He felt it, warm, alive, everything he'd fought to protect but never truly deserved. When he pulled away, he wasn't the Mafia boss. Not anymore. He was just a man walking into the darkness to protect the only light he'd ever known. Downstairs, the air was heavy with rain and gunmetal. The men waiting for him were younger, hungrier, ruthless in their ambition. Their leader stepped forward, smirking. "You've gone soft, D'Amato. The streets are watching. They want their king back, or his funeral." Lorenzo said nothing. He took off his coat, laid it neatly over a chair, and stepped into the open courtyard. The storm above had returned, lightning splitting the sky like the blade of fate itself. The first shot came fast, a warning. Then the courtyard erupted. Gunfire tore through the night, echoing through marble halls and the heart of the mansion. But Lorenzo D'Amato did not flinch. He moved with precision, a predator honed by years of survival. Every shot he fired was a memory of the man he used to be. Every life he took, a nail in the coffin of his old self. By the time the thunder faded, silence returned. Bodies lay scattered, smoke rising from the earth, and the once mighty boss stood in the center, bleeding, but alive. The empire he had built now lay in ruins. But as he looked up at the balcony, he saw Isabella holding Sophia close, her eyes filled with tears and light. He fell to his knees, the rain mixing with his blood. And in that moment, Lorenzo understood that he hadn't fought for power. Not anymore, he had fought for the right to change. Days later, the mansion grew quiet again. The underworld whispered of a new D'Amato, one who ruled no territory but his home, no men but his own heart. The city found peace not through fear, but through his silence. He never spoke of that night again, but sometimes, when the rain returned, he would hold Sophia close and watch Isabella move through the garden, her white dress fluttering in a wind. He had lost the kingdom the world gave him, but gained one far greater, built not on fear, but on love. And for the first time, when Sophia smiled up at him, he smiled back, not as a man trying to escape his past, but as one who had finally learned to live. The sea was calm that morning, a blue mirror stretching endlessly beneath a golden sky. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and lavender from the gardens, the same ones Isabella had planted years ago when the world still whispered Lorenzo D'Amato's name in fear. Now, it whispered differently, and no longer as a warning, but as a legend of a man who had once ruled the city's underworld and then vanished. Not in blood, but in silence. Lorenzo stood on the balcony of a modest villa by the coast, dressed in simple linen, his hands resting against the cold iron rail. His hair had grown silver at the temples. The lines on his face spoke of battles fought within more than those fought outside. But his eyes, once dark and sharp, now held something softer, quieter. Behind him, laughter echoed from the garden. Sophia, now 12, chased the family's old dog through the grass while Isabella watched from a bench beneath the olive tree. The sun wrapped them in light, turning the scene into something sacred, something Lorenzo had never dared to believe he'd live long enough to see. He watched them for a long while, his heart heavy with gratitude and quiet guilt, as so much of the world he had destroyed to protect this small piece of it, as so many ghosts buried beneath the piece he now walked upon. But that was the price of redemption. It never came free. Years had passed since the night the guns went silent. After the blood on the courtyard stones had dried, Lorenzo dismantled everything he once controlled. He sold the ports, the warehouses, the businesses that thrived on fear. His men, those who had lived by his word, were given money, land, and a choice, disappear or die by the very violence they had served. Most chose to disappear, and when it was done, Lorenzo D'Amato walked away. He moved his family far from Palermo, to the quiet edge of Amalfi, where the sea met the cliffs, and the world forgot men like him existed. The house he bought was smaller, but it was filled with something grander than wealth, laughter, warmth, forgiveness. In those early months, he struggled to adjust. The nights were the hardest. He would wake drenched in sweat, his mind replaying gunfire and screams that were no longer real. But every time he woke, Isabella was there. Sometimes she held his hand. Sometimes she said nothing at all, and that silence was enough to keep him from breaking. Over time, he learned the rituals of ordinary life. He woke early, not to plan his empire, but to make breakfast with Sophia. Always too much toast, never enough jam. He learned how to fix the gate that creaked when the wind blew, how to plant tomatoes in the garden, how to build a swing from the old oak tree. And every Sunday, he and Isabella would walk to the village market, hand in hand, unnoticed by the people who passed them by. He liked it that way. Anonymity. To live as a shadow, but one born of peace, not of fear. Sometimes the locals would ask his name, and he would smile faintly. Lorenzo, he'd say. Never D'Amato, just Lorenzo. But peace, he discovered, is not something you inherit. It's something you build, moment by moment, choice by choice. There were days when the past tried to claw its way back, old faces appearing in the news, or letters arriving without return addresses. He burned them all. He owed nothing to that world anymore. His daughter was his world now. Sophia had inherited her father's sharp eyes, but her mother's heart. She grew with kindness in her hands and fire in her soul, unafraid to speak truth, unafraid to love. Sometimes, when she sat by the window reading, her profile caught the light just right, and Lorenzo would feel tears burn behind his eyes. She was his second chance made flesh. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Isabella found Lorenzo sitting on the rocks near the water. The waves crashed gently below, the sound steady and rhythmic like the heartbeat of the world itself. She sat beside him, tucking her hair behind her ear, her fingers brushing his. "It's been 10 years, she whispered. "Do you ever miss it?" He didn't answer immediately. He watched the sea, vast, endless, untamed, and thought of the empire he once ruled, the fear that once built his name. "Sometimes," he admitted quietly, "but only the parts that made me feel alive, not the parts that made me less human." She smiled faintly, turning her head toward him. "You're more human now than anyone I've ever known." He chuckled softly, the sound low, almost shy. "You're the reason I became one." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a long while, they simply sat, two souls once shaped by chaos, now breathing in the stillness they had earned. As night fell, lanterns flickered to life along the garden path. Sophia's laughter echoed again. She was chasing fireflies, her small hands glowing with light each time she caught one. Lorenzo watched her, his heart full and aching. He remembered the man he once was, the killer, the boss, the monster the city feared. And then he looked at his daughter, radiant and innocent, and realized that none of that power had ever truly meant anything. This laughter, this love, this peace was his legacy. Not the blood, not the empire, but the smile of a child who knew nothing of the darkness her father had once commanded. Years later, when the world finally forgot the name Lorenzo D'Amato, a new name began to echo quietly along the coast. Senior Lorenzo, the kind man with the silver hair who always bought flowers for his wife and ice cream for the children who played by the pier. And sometimes on warm evenings, those children would see him sitting by the sea, sketching in an old notebook, and no one knew what he wrote. But if one had looked closely, they would have seen 3 names written at the top of every page. Isabella. Sophia. Family. He wrote not of blood or war, but of love, the kind that redeems even the darkest heart. And as the sun set, painting the waves gold and crimson, Lorenzo would look toward the horizon and whisper to the wind, his voice soft and steady. "For my daughter's smile, I gave up the world, and in her smile, I found another." The waves carried the words away, their echo fading into eternity, and thus ended the story of the man who once ruled through fear and was reborn through love.